Okay, the time is 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific, 12 o'clock noon Central, and it's time for another webinar with the Rural Policy Learning Commons. I'd like to invite, or rather greet everybody, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Michael Blatherwick. I work for the Rural Policy Learning Commons and the Rural Development Institute at Breen University. We have an excellent topic today on rural youth workforce development. And we will have three speakers. Our second speaker is Dianne Looker. She'll speak to rural and urban youth leaving and staying and moving. She comes from Nova Scotia and has past been with a professor at Acadia and at Mount St. Vincent in Halifax. Our last speaker today will be Sarah Breen. She currently works with the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute and will be looking at youth transition. And our first speaker today will be Ray Bollman, who will talk about rural youth and labor force. And he has worked for a number of years with StatsCan and is a research affiliate with the Rural Development Institute at Brandon University. Just taking care of a couple housekeeping items. Each presentation will be approximately between 15 and 20 minutes. And after all three presentations are final, we will open the floor to our panel, our participants for questions. To ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and I will read each question aloud to the presenters, and they will be able to verbally answer your question for you. So the Q&A box is very important for those questions that you have. You can type those questions in anytime, and then I will go through them at the end of the session. So even while they're presenting, if you have something that you would like clarification on, feel free to type it in, and I'll keep track of the questions as they come in. Also, if you have a comment that's not related to a specific question but are having any problems, there is a chat box. So feel free to use the chat box if you're having any issues with your computer. I can address any comments there. The materials today will be recorded and posted on the RPLC YouTube site for all participants to view at a later time. And also, we will make available the PDF copies of everyone's presentation as well. So once this is all done, we'll post it online and we will email you the link to see those materials. Lastly, I just wanted to mention, because Zoom is an internet-based program, and for some of you who might be tuning in from rural parts of North America and possibly Europe, sometimes glitches with interruption of service may occur. The webinar will continue as planned. As I mentioned, it is recorded, so if you miss anything, don't worry, you will be able to catch up on what you might have missed. And also, in my experience, sometimes any glitch, usually the program does reboot, but if it doesn't reboot for you, feel free to go and reboot the program using the login information that you have. So I am going to pass it off to Ray. I'll just make sure that his microphone is on, and I'll close my other windows here. So we have his slide, and I just need to make sure that I have Ray unmuted. Ray, are you there with us?
I'm here. Thank you, Michael.
Perfect. There you are. So your presentation is up, and I'm not clocking you. You can talk as long as you want, because it's always a pleasure to hear you. So
we'll work on that.
Great.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to whomever hoodwinked me into doing this. I'm more interested in what Sarah has to say in the Kootenays. My contract was 12 minutes, so I'm going to see if I can do this in 12 minutes. I'm going to talk about the context of youth employment. And the next slide will go through sort of the 12 key points I want to make. But the first 6 are talking about the demographic context. Number 7 is youth migration. Number 8 is share of youth in school. And then 9, 10, 11, 12 are talking about youth employment in non-metro BC. But first, the next slide says, I should point out where the Kootenay region is for those of us who would like to visit but seldom get there. It's in southeast BC. It consists almost entirely of the headwaters of the Columbia River, which flows south into the U.S. and then forms the border between Oregon and Washington before flowing into the Pacific. And within the Kootenay region are 3 regional districts, which in Stats Canada's terms would be census divisions: East Kootenay, Central Kootenay, and Kootenay Boundary. The next chart just says where the Kootenay Basin is. There's southeast BC. The next chart shows where the Kootenay economic region is, and all of that is one color. Those are the 3 regional districts. It's one color, and this particular map is showing negative population change between 2014 and 2015. And the next map shows the 3 regional districts, and not a great map, sorry. But anyway, if you look at the purple square, East Kootenay is on the east part of the Kootenays, and it's colored dark orange, which was more than 5 people per 1,000 net positive internal migration between 2014 and 2015. The yellow square goes to Central Kootenay, less yellow, 0 positive, but less than 5 internal migrants from the rest of Canada per 1,000 into that region. And then the Kootenay Boundary down the U.S. border is light purple, which was negative migration in 2014 to 2015 in Kootenay Boundary. So those 3 regional districts are part of the Kootenay economic region, and you can see where it's colored. That's in the valleys where people live, and the mountains have very few people, and that's white in that map. So getting back to my introductory slide there, the first observation is that BC's non-metro population is growing slowly. And non-metro is the population outside of a center of 100,000 and more. So the next chart gives the graph of the level of non-metro employment, 1.37 in 1996 on the red line, 101.43 million in 2015 and 2015, sorry, and that's up 60,000, so not a big increase. The next chart shows the year-to-year increase, and the height of the red bars is showing the year-to-year increase. And red has always been less than blue. Metro has always been growing faster than the red. But the red, the non-metro, has been growing since the 2002, 2003 period, but just at a smaller rate. Then the next chart makes the point that if your population is growing at a smaller rate, the share of non-metro population in BC is declining. It was 35% in 1996, and now it's down to 31%. So moving on to the second topic I wanted to mention, BC has fewer potential labor market entrants than potential labor market retirees. That's a potential labor shortage. So I'm going to calculate an index. On the next slide, show how I'm doing the index. It's an index of demographic pressure. The numerator is people 10 to 19, potential market entrants, as a percent of people 55 to 64, potential exiters. So if it's greater than 100%, you got more people potentially coming into the labor force than leaving. If you're less than 100, you have more people leaving, fewer people coming on than the number of people exiting. So the next chart shows this trend over time. You can see way back in the late 70s, you had over 200 people coming on the workforce for every 100 people leaving. This is at the BC level. In the mid-80s, it was 150. And in 2008, it's gone below 0. So you have fewer people coming onto the workforce than leaving the workforce just within the demography. And that's going to stay the situation in BC going out 20, 30 years, regardless of what the trends are in projections, which is regardless of the level of immigration. Now, it's interesting that, that's a decline in the workforce. Well, some people have done projections in the workforce, and they're saying more older people will keep working. And in fact, maybe the workforce would grow at max 1%. But look at the growth of the workforce way back when, and that was looking at high GDP growth in the economy. Now it's going to be much harder to have high GDP growth in the economy because the workforce is getting much more tight. Next chart just makes the point that this demographic pressure is happening in metro and non-metro areas. It went below 100% in non-metro BC in 2007. And the next point, the chart shows, the map shows that it's deep blue here in the Kootenay region. Less than 85 people are coming onto the workforce for every 100 people that are aging and should be retiring. So labor market pressures there, and you can see much of rural BC looks quite dark blue. The next number I want to talk about is just mention the point that the population in the Columbia Basin or the Kootenay region has been essentially flat over 2 decades. Some decline in the Kootenay boundary region. You can look at the hidden slides to see that. Number 4, the next slide just makes the point that there's been positive natural balance in the East Kootenay region, more births than deaths, but more deaths than births in the Kootenay boundary. Number 5 is making the point that in the first half of the 2000s, there was net migration out of the Kootenays. But in the last 10 years, the pattern has varied, and some years there's been positive net migration into the Kootenays. Number 6 is saying that immigrants, international immigrants moving into the Kootenays, it is happening, but it's very small, at most 0.25% per year of increase in population due to immigration, compared to the Canadian average of 0.7, and some places in Canada it's 3% a year. Number 7 on my list is getting to some more data here. We're looking at the net out migration of youth happening for those 15 to 19, the smaller rate of net out migration for younger adults 20 to 24, and in the Kootenays there's a small net in migration for young adults 25 to 29. So the next chart looks at how I'm doing this calculation. So the black line is the population 15 to 19 in period T plus 1. So T plus 1 on the very left is 1996, and there were 11,100 people 15 to 19 years of age in the Kootenay region in 1996. So hit the next button, and we have the green line, and now in 2001, that would be T equals 5, the population 20 to 24, it was down to 8,100. So you lost, what, 3,000 people. The next chart just does the calculation of that net out migration. So looked at the people 15 to 19, 5 years later, look at the people 20 to 24, and there's a net loss of over 3,000 people, 1996 to 2001. That was 27%. And by 2010 to 2015, there's a loss of 1,300 people, which was a loss of 15%. And this is a conversation, is the glass half full or half empty? The green line is very high, lots of retention, or maybe they've left for 4 years and came back. They got their some post-secondary education and came back. So there is a loss, but you kept a lot of people. And I think that's a point for discussion. You know, you cannot get a degree, a medical degree in the Kootenays, so you have to leave if you're going to become a doctor. So maybe you want everybody to leave and then come back for good jobs. So that's part of the conversation. The next chart does the same calculation for 20 to 24 in the first period, and what's the net migration by the time they're 25 to 29. Very small net out migration, but still continuous net out migration for most of those years. Then the next chart looks at young adults in the first period, 25 to 29, and what's the situation when they're 30 to 34. And you can see positive net in migration for most of the periods, and certainly relatively large there in 2006, 2007, up to a 21% increase in population, people moving back in, moving in, but maybe moving back in. So that's my observation on net migration. The next thing is looking at schooling rates. And the next chart will show, just for BC as a whole, percent of the population in school. So the green line is 15 to 16. So that looks like 95 to 97, 95 to 90, 95 to 99% are being in school. The blue line, say, since 1997 has 70 to 80% being in school. And the red line looking at, say, since 1997, 25 to 30% being in school. So for the last 15, 17 years, you've had about the same share of young people in school in BC. The next chart looks at a comparison of percent who are students, full-time or part-time, 15 to 19 years of age, and by the time you get to the end of the chart, you've got about 77% of non-metro youth still in school. And these are ones that are living in non-metro, and 77% are in school, much lower than in metro areas, but flat, and nothing has changed basically over, what, 17 years. Although non-metro youth in this age group are slightly less likely to be in school if they're living in non-metro. The next chart looks at an older age group, 20 to 24, and here, yes, by 2014, 48% of metro were in school, 23% of non-metro were in school, so a lower share of non-metro are in school, but the pattern has been quite consistent over time. Not much change in terms of trend, in my view. And the next chart looks at 25 to 29, and at the end of the period, 15% of metro are in school, 8% of non-metro are in school, and again, not much change over time. So the point of all this is that non-metro are less likely to be in school, but the change over time has not been very big. Now, if we move on to are you likely to be employed, I want to compare it to the core age workforce 25 to 54. And the next chart is looking at 25 to 54, and 1999, 2001, 2002 for this group, 76% are employed, and it peaked just before the collapse. It peaked in 2008 at 82% being employed. And this is non-metro. So now I want to ask, are non-students working at the same rate as the core workforce? And if you're 25 to 29, you're equally likely to be employed as the core workforce in non-metro BC. The next chart looks at 20 to 24, and you can see they were equally likely to be employed when things were booming, 2004 to 2006. But at the end of the period, they were 6% less likely to be working. 75% were 75% or 74% were working, compared to 80% for the core age workforce and the older ones, 25 to 29. The next chart saying that 15 to 19 bounce all over the place. So moving on to number 10 in my list of things to talk about. Here I want to talk about comparing metro and non-metro in BC working in the school year. So let's look at those first. And so the orange line at the top is metro non-students 15 to 19. Earlier we knew that in metro had fewer people being students. So these are just looking at non-students in the top. And the black and the orange look very similar. So if you're 15 to 19 in BC, in metro or non-metro, you're about equally likely to be employed. And the dotted lines at the bottom, or if you're students and 15 to 19, again, you're about equally likely to be employed. We're looking at the 8 school months, so September to April. So I'm not mixing up summer work versus school term work, just looking in the school term. All the lines are just in the school term. And so the bottom line is saying that 35% of students are working in the school months, both in metro and non-metro. And again, there's very little metro or non-metro difference in these two lines, which is my question, is non-metro different? The next chart looks at a different age group, 20 to 24, and the general pattern is for non-students at the top, metro and non-metro are equally likely to be employed, and for students, the dotted lines at the bottom, metro and non-metro are about equally likely to be employed. And the next chart looks at 25 to 29. Well, the non-student black line is always below the orange line, so non-students 25 to 29 are slightly less likely to be employed than the orange, but it looks about the same to me. And the dotted lines bounce all over, but I don't think there's a difference between metro and non-metro students. So I'm ticking right along here. Let's look at number 10. I want to compare metro and non-metro students during the summer months. So none of them are in school. Well, 15 to 16, that bounces all over us, so maybe that's a Picasso print more than an analysis. The next one, next chart, looks at 17 to 19, and during the summer months, 17 and 19-year-olds in metro and non-metro are both equally likely to be employed. Non-metro full-time students, the dotted line, looks higher than metro full-time students. So maybe non-metro full-time students, 17 or 19, are more likely or doing better at getting jobs than metro full-time students. The next chart looks at an older age group, the 20 to 24. During the summer months, the non-students are equally likely to be employed in metro versus non-metro. The full-time students in non-metro, again, those dotted lines are higher for black than for orange, so non-metro full-time students are generally more likely to have a job in the summer months. The next chart, moving right along, oops, can we back up? I forget what I'm talking about here. Number 11, number 12. Number 11, by age 25 to 29, young adults in non-metro BC have about the same mix of jobs as everybody working. So now I remember what I'm talking about, so move to the next table here. The left-hand column at the top, it says people that are 20 to 24 have 8% of all the jobs held by everybody 15 plus. 8% of the jobs. But if you look at the line that's purple, the trade, working in the trades, the people that age have 12% of the jobs. So they're 50% more likely to be working in trade. Those are clerks and retail stores, and so they're more likely to be working in that industry group. But if you go follow the trade line across, it's 10% in 25 to 29 years of age. So 25 to 29, at the very top row, 9% of everybody working in non-metro BC was 25 to 29. They have 9% of the jobs, and they have 10% of the trade jobs. So the pattern for 25 to 29 basically gets back to the same pattern across all of these industry groups. At the bottom, 20 to 24, you see accommodation and food services. 18% of these young folks are working in bars and restaurants. But in 25 to 29, 11% are working in bars or restaurants, which is higher than their average share of 9%. But there's a significant convergence back to what the total workforce is looking like. So the point was, by the time young people are 25 to 29 in non-metro BC, their industry of work looks similar to the average. And the next chart is doing the same thing for occupations. So again, top left-hand number is 8%. We saw that before. 8% of all jobs, non-metro jobs, are held by people 20 to 24. The one purple line is sales and service. 14% of the jobs in sales and service are held by people 20 to 24. But by the time you get to 25 to 29, 9% of those jobs are held by young adults 25 to 29, which is their same share as their total participation in non-metro BC, which is 9%. The other purple line is showing that by the time young people in non-metro are 25 to 29, they have 9% of the occupations in health, doctors and nurses, and that's the same share they have of all occupations. So their profile approaches the overall workforce by the time non-metro young people become 25 to 29. And I think there's one more chart here, one more point. Most job vacancies in the Kootenay are in traditional low-wage jobs. There's lots of detail in the hidden slides, but I have one slide that makes a point. This is from Statistics Canada's new job vacancy and wage survey. The third quarter is, third column is the third quarter of 2015. There were 2,160 job vacancies in the Kootenay economic region. Half of those, 1,225, were in sales and service occupations. And that's where young people are working. We just saw that. And that's where the job opportunities are. And the wage offer is low, $12 and something. I think the minimum wage is $10.45 in BC, so it is above minimum wage, but it is a low wage job. So next slide just summarizes what I've been talking about. I've been talking about demographic context. I've been talking about the schooling context, and I've been talking about the employment context for non-metro youth in BC. And the next slide says, I'd answer some questions, and Michael says I'm off the hook till the end of the session. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks, Ray. And you know, one thing in your start when you said who put you on the hook for this, it reminded me that I really didn't give the proper props to the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute, because they're the ones that helped bring all the speakers together. And a lot of that was Terry McDonald and Sarah Breen. My job as part of RPLC is mostly just a technical guy. I'm the guy who knows how to click all the buttons, and I'm like the Houston control. But all of the work to bring this webinar together was done by the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute. So lots of thanks to that. So I am going to turn it over to Dianne. So I'm going to unmute Dianne. Dianne, you're there?
I'm here.
Great. And so you want to go through the share screen and pull your PowerPoint presentation up. And Dianne is also from sunny Nova Scotia, as I hear it's good weather there today.
It is. Beautiful. We may get spring yet.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
So
take it away.
Thank you. So I also want to thank people for inviting me and for agreeing to sit and listen to us. Ray talked about a lot of the big picture issues in terms of overall in BC and in the Kootenays, and some of the big patterns for youth in rural and non-rural. Migration was a small part of what he talked about, and I'm going to focus primarily on migration and youth migration into and out of rural areas. So I'm going to, I think I missed my, there it is, the outline of my presentation. So this is what I'm going to talk about, basically looking at what the young people said they were going to do, what they actually did, and some of their attitudes, and how that can help us understand some of the mobility decisions that they made. I'm drawing on data from a research project that I did with some help from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It was a longitudinal study of young people, primarily in Nova Scotia, but some from Hamilton, Ontario.
I'm just going to pause you just for 1 second, Dianne.
Okay.
Sarah, I'm unmuting you for a second. Can you see on your screen the PowerPoint presentation or just a picture of Dianne?
I see the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, okay. When I have my recording button on, and it was just focused on Dianne, so I didn't want the whole recording to be just Dianne. Not that you're not.
I was going to say. Means you'd have to listen carefully.
I know. It's good. It's good. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. So the survey that we undertook was a longitudinal study of the same youth, following them from age 17 through to age 28. We surveyed them at several points in time, but the ones I'm going to focus on today were the surveys at age 17, 22, and 28. There's a wealth of quantitative data from these surveys, and there's also some very rich qualitative quotes from the open-ended questions and also some intensive interviews. So let's look first at where the youth are actually living at the different age groups. 27% of them were living in rural areas at age 17, and that reflects the population living in rural Nova Scotia at the time. Fewer of them were living in rural areas at age 22, and at age 28, they're back up to 28%. Now, there's a caveat that those who returned to their the community that they were living in at age 17 were easier to track down. So there was some bias in the sample attrition over the course of this of the study, as you might expect. Those who were more mobile were harder to track down. We asked them at the 3 ages whether they planned to stay in their current community. At age 17, it was open-ended. It didn't say for any time frame. So it included those that planned to go away and perhaps come back. So about a little less than a third of the rural youth and over half, 58% of the urban youth said they did plan to stay in their current community. You see those who are rural by age 22, they're currently living in rural areas. Over half of them say they plan to stay in the specific community they're living in at that point. Urban, the number's 63%. By age 28, over 2/3 of the rural who are now living in rural say they're going to stay. So I think this is important to keep in mind, that the outmigration perhaps for education need not be permanent, and that in fact many of them plan to stay. The urban youth are more likely to say that they are want to be mobile even after age 28. So it's the rural that are staying put once you get to the older age groups. If we look at what they actually did, as opposed to what they planned to do, the 5-year period from age 17 to 22, about 27% of the rural migrated out of rural areas into an urban area. Only 3% of urban youth did the reverse. If we look from age 22 to 28, you see a slightly higher number migrating from rural to urban, but also a slightly higher number migrating from urban to rural. And if you look at the whole time frame, about 38% migrate from rural to urban. That means 62% are in rural. Rural, 62% are still in rural by the end of their 20s. And while it's a much smaller number, we do see that there are some urban that move to rural, and there's potential here to attract youth from urban, perhaps to compensate for the outmigration from rural areas. And there are some initiatives that have been done in different areas that I can talk about if you like. So the issue may not be retention in the same community, but attracting in migrants, perhaps from urban areas. We also asked them about mobility to and from the specific community in which they're living. And here we see that about half of the rural youth are living in the same community 5 years after when they're 22 years old. 80% of the urban are not very mobile in this time period, partially because they're attending post-secondary institutions in their urban area. If we look at the longer time frame from 17 to 28, about a third of the rural youth are in the same community, but half of them are in the same community or the same county, in the area near their original community. The numbers for urban are 44% in the same community and 60% in the same area. So it's clear, comparing this slide to the last one, that even if rural youth leave their home community, they often move to other rural communities. In terms of a little bit of detail, rural youth moved twice as often as urban. They made twice as many discrete moves, and they lived in more locales. That is, they weren't just moving back and forth, for example, from Wolfville to Halifax. They are living in different places. But most of the moves for both the rural and the urban youth were fairly short, 100 to 120 kilometers. They might be longer in BC, especially out of the Kootenays, but this small distance reflects the distances in Nova Scotia where my study was based. So a lot of research on rural youth and rural communities emphasizes attitudes to communities, ties feelings of belongings to rural communities as the reason that many rural youth and rural adults stay and return to their rural communities. But one point I want to make, and I've made in other presentations, is that urban youth also feel positively about their community, especially a particular neighborhood in their city, even if it's a very large city. So rural youth don't have the monopoly on feeling close to their community. However, there is some evidence that more of them feel very strongly about their community. So the next slide is one piece of evidence that documents this. So this is their level of agreement with the statement, this place, the place that they're living at the time, will always be home to me. And the two bars at the bottom, the sort of deep blue or light blue, are those who agree with this statement. The deep blue are those who strongly agree. And if you compare rural and urban, the two left-hand bars at age 17, you see that there's not a lot of difference in the rural and urban respondents in terms of whether they agree that this place will always be home. There's a bit more of a difference at age 28, where more of the rural youth agree and more of them strongly agree that this place will always be home, which is reflected in the fact that we saw earlier that they are more likely to say they plan to stay in their current community. Again, another measure of their attitude to their community: even if I leave this place, I'll come back. The two columns on the left are at age 17, and the two columns on the right at age 28. Not much difference at age 17, but those who are living in rural versus urban at age 28, rural are more likely to say that they agree that even if I leave this place, I'll come back. So we asked them what their perceptions were of those who leave and those who stay. Unfortunately, we only asked it at age 17, but it does give us some insight. And I can't give all the detailed answers here. But basically, when we asked who leaves, the kind of comments were those who want to make something of themselves, are ambitious, they're independent. But those who stay are not the opposite of that. They're not unambitious, they're not lazy. They're other positive assets. Those who care about family, who care about community, those with roots here. So this is consistent, other research that other analyses of this data set that I've done and other research that I'm familiar with show that when youth leave, especially rural communities, they tend to leave for jobs and for education. They stay or return for community and family. But one of the things that I want to talk about very briefly is that it's much more complicated than that. That it's not simply family for the sake of family, that there's ways in which families and friends and community facilitate moves. So one of the ways in which families facilitate moves or staying or returning is by providing living arrangements for young people. And I'm going to give you some quotes. Moved to my parents' home to save money. Moved back with my mother and worked at my job in Windsor just for convenience sake. I lived with my brother to get out of my parents' home. My brother was here and I could stay with him, so I had a place to stay and work. I had free room and board with relatives and commuted back and forth from school. My aunt lived there and said, try the West, stay with her and see how I liked it. This is where I grew up. I lived with my grandmother while I go to university. I moved in with my grandfather when I left my husband, and this is where my parents live. To save money, to save up for the down payment of a house, I have an apartment in the basement of my parents' house. I left secretarial school because I didn't like it, and the only place I had to go was home. I have a lot of relatives, so lodging was available. I came to stay with my parents after my baby was born. Friends can also provide or facilitate living arrangements. I moved here for work. My sister's boy moved there too. A friend found us a place. I moved there with friends. There were 5 of us that went. I was boarding there with a friend's family. I had connections, someone I knew I could live with for a bit till I got established. Family responsibilities also play a role in terms of particularly bringing young people back to their home communities. When my grandfather died, my uncle asked us to come and live here to help with the upkeep of the house. My mother is sick and I came to help out with my family. My mother has Alzheimer's. My grandmother had breast cancer. I came back to help on the farm. My dad's in a wheelchair and my mom had cancer, so we wanted to be close to them and close to a hospital. Family also can provide work and facilitate work, as we've already seen through living arrangements, but also in other ways. I'm home working because I couldn't find anything else. We heard there were jobs here, and my husband's from the area. Well, it's my birth home, and I'm working here till my money situation is better. This is where my father's business is, and this is where I'll be doing my apprenticeship. My old job was there. I'm able to save money and live with my parents. That's where I call home, and that's where I work for my father at the car dealership. My husband inherited the farm from his dad. His family house, we decided we'd live there. So often it's with parents or with husbands or wives, but also other relationships. My boyfriend was working up there, so we moved. We lived there, and then we moved back when his job ended. My husband works here. He convinced me to move up. It was close to his work and not too far from mine. I moved with my girlfriend and hoped to find a job. She was working up there, so we moved. My boyfriend got transferred to here, so I was unemployed at the time, so I came down with him. I moved in with my boyfriend. I thought I loved him. And as we've seen, feelings of familiarity and ties to community and feeling of comfort level living in a familiar area are important, particularly to rural. I picked this community because my grandmother lived here and I know people in the area. I'd stayed here in summers. I had stayed here in summers and liked it. My family's here. It's my home. Someone who returned from Port McMurray to rural Nova Scotia. After 2 years, I was ready to come back. I didn't have any family out there. I grew up here and his parents were close. We're close to family, friends, and everything. It was closer to my family and I wanted to be with my family and friends and everyone I grew up with. I've always been living near here and I've always enjoyed it and I know a lot of people here. So, to sum up, most rural and urban youth plan to stay in their home community, or many of them do. Most of them actually do stay or return to their home area. Many of the rural youth who leave their home community migrate to other rural communities. But there are some urban youth that migrate to rural, and as I said earlier, there's a potential to capitalize on this and perhaps mitigate some of that downward employment possibilities that Ray was talking about. But one of the main things I want to leave you with is that the decision about where to live is a complex process. It's not simply about jobs, it's not simply about education, it's not simply about family. Many of the decisions are interconnected with others, and if you're entering a relationship, leaving a relationship, or that relationship facilitates jobs or housing arrangements, then that can have a huge impact on the decisions that youth make in terms of where to live and where to move. Thank you very much. Great.
Thanks, Dianne. And that'll bring us to our last presenter, Sarah Breen from, is it sunny in the Columbia Basin?
Oh, it's gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous.
Okay, that's great. So if you want to pull up a presentation there.
Okay, is that showing up for everyone?
Yep, I can see that. That's good.
Perfect. So my presentation today is going to focus on some findings from a project I was working on this fall. And the original project was called Training, Engagement, and Retention, a Learning Region Approach to Rural Youth. And what I'm going to talk about today focuses on some of the findings from the literature that I was looking at, as well as some consultations that I did with youth around this region, as well as experts that work with youth on a daily basis. So just to kick things off, this is an overview of the project that I did, and those are the research questions that we started with. So really trying to understand the relationship between youth and rural regional development, and understand the ties between different sectors, so between, say, education and business, or government, not-for-profits, and really how that big picture fits together. Looking at the critical issues around things like retention, training, engagement, and understanding the challenges and opportunities that are out there, specific to the Kootenays as well as more generally across other rural areas in the country. And then kind of what actions do we need? What actions do we need here locally? What can we build on looking at other places? And then, of course, to kind of contribute to ongoing research. I'm not going to get into the details of my methods because I want to focus on the findings, but if anyone has any questions about those, I'd be happy to answer. So first, an overview of what I found doing a literature review. And the good news is that for regions that are struggling with what to do with their youth, whether it's for employment or for retention, that type of thing, is there are a lot of other areas that are dealing with the same challenge. So you have an advantage of a good starting point. You can look to other examples. And so when it comes to learning from others, I've summarized, a couple hundred articles in 5 bullets. So obviously that's not all the detail that's there, but these are some critical points. The first one's kind of get them early and get them often. A lot of the studies that I was reading was saying that by the end of high school, students really have a pretty good idea as to where they want to go and what they're looking to do, and where they want to move to. So any workforce development program or an engagement program that can be put in earlier in that K-12 system and more often will have a bigger impact than, say, something that comes at the end of high school. Engagement really matters. So youth need to be brought to the table, and they need to be viewed equally and with respect, so that we're not designing programs for the youth, we're designing programs with the youth. Encourage them to leave. I think this has been touched on a couple of times, but building into that engagement piece is giving them a reason to return, so that they go out, they get a degree, they go traveling, they meet other people, and then they have this strong attachment of somewhere to come back to. Multiple collaborative efforts. Not everyone is going to be able to address everything. That's just a given. We all have limited resources. So when it comes to dealing with issues around youth, it's an incremental process, and it requires collaborative efforts of a lot of people. And focusing on the positives. So there are a lot of challenges, and I'll cover some of them today. But it's critical for everyone to look at what they can do, because there's always something that you can do. Key factors, again, pulled from the literature, looking at making decisions based on evidence-based decision-making. Not everyone's like me and enjoys reading articles by the hundreds on the weekends, but there are people that you can turn to, whether it's the RPLC or the Rural Development Institutes, that will help you gather this information to make decisions. Change is a big constant right now. So when we're developing programs or initiatives, they have to be able to be flexible and deal with that change. Place matters and context matters. So these are 2 critically important factors across all the literature that I read. When it comes to attracting or retaining people, creating that place that's going to set your community or your region apart from others. And context-wise, consider where you are. When you're looking to other examples, it might seem like a great idea, but maybe it won't work for you locally. So really thinking about that context. Being inclusive. I was at a conference last year, and I won't say where, but part of their youth employee retention strategy was, quote, get the guys mortgaged and married. As a female sitting in that audience, I was pretty insulted. That's an example of a retention strategy that is both sexist and really based on a negative campaign. They're literally looking to shackle youth to their community as opposed to give them a reason to stay there. So that's not what you want to do. And then finally, collaboration. Again, your organizations in communities and regions are a lot stronger when they're working together. And I pulled a few examples. Let's see. This first one is a screen grab from a program we have locally in the Nelson area. It's a Skills Link program, and it's aimed for youth that have a lot of barriers. And so they get 5 weeks of in-class training, and that's certificates, developing communication skills, all sorts of stuff. And then they go out into a work placement for 7 weeks. So it's 12 weeks total. The whole thing is paid. So they're paid for training and their work experience. And it's a really positive program aimed at dealing with youth that face a lot of barriers. There's an example of a mailbox program where this one's from the United States, where graduating high school students are given a mailbox and a letter from the community saying that, you know, you might want to go out and experience everything the world has to offer, but please come home and always consider this your home. Along with that, keeping ties by continuous engagement with youth, having pancake breakfasts over Christmas while students are home, that type of thing. And then the last example I've got is from Newfoundland. And this is a great example of a one-stop shop for resources. This website, it's nlyouth.ca. It's got resources, programs, awards, scholarships, basically almost everything you could think of that youth may want to get involved with, or programs that they may want to use, and it's all conveniently in one location. So that's an awesome example. All right, so getting into more of my local findings, I asked youth within this region, as well as experts that work with youth on a daily basis, a lot of questions around training, education, engagement, and retention. Obviously, I won't be able to go over everything today. So I put up these 5, kind of like the key themes of what I heard about. So active engagement, the need for that active engagement with youth, having easy access like those one-stop shops I was talking about, reducing challenges, and this is where I'm going to focus a lot of my slides to come in the next bit of the presentation, improving perceptions and narratives around youth in rural areas, and then again dealing with that the constant change and need for adaptation. So let's look at a couple of the challenges and how to deal with these challenges. So initially, my project was aimed at a portion of the youth population that we didn't know a lot about. So people, we were calling them the floaters, 17 to 25, they're unemployed or underemployed, not really sure what they're going to do. And my initial job was to go out and kind of figure out what these people were looking for, what could help. And what I found is they're really difficult to identify, and they're very difficult to engage. And the more I dug into this, it seems as though folks that end up in this particular category are those folks that face barriers and challenges, and those are cumulative. So the volume of barriers and challenges gets to be so that perhaps by the age of 25, there really isn't a training program or an educational course. There's no one specific program that's going to solve those. So the best idea for dealing with that particular section of the youth population is to avoid having them start in the first place. Get back to that, get them early, get them off, and get the supports in the K-12 system to avoid having this issue later on. Individual challenges. So we're talking about workforce development, and we automatically jump to things like training or job experience. But when I was asking people questions about what challenges they faced when it came to getting a job, or what challenges they faced getting training or that type of thing, it's peripheral issues. You've got issues of poverty and socioeconomic barriers. There's people with negative institutional experiences, so growing up in a foster system, or negative experiences at school, lacking role models, mental health issues, addiction, substance abuse, gaps in literacy, financial issues, housing, transit. All of these challenges get to the point where you can put all these programs out there, but the people who need them most will have an increasing number of challenges accessing those programs if these individual issues aren't dealt with. Institutional and other overarching challenges, and cheekily labeled A for effort, D for execution. There are a lot of great programs out there, but right now what I was hearing is that there's a disconnect between the programs that are offered and the youth themselves. A lot of great quotes from teenagers and early 20s, folks in their early 20s who are saying they put up a poster, or they put up a Facebook group and think that that's enough, that they're not being attracted by that. So this disconnect is really a challenge. And that's not being helped by the fact that there's multiple overlapping organizations working on this that don't talk to each other. I recognize that institutional mandates and structures are a complicated thing that won't change overnight, but the limitations around programs and requirements has it such that there's all these little pockets and youth are unaware of what's out there, and a lot of institutions and programs that could be helping each other aren't. And all of that is further complicated by overarching changes in the economy, biases against youth, and frankly, a lot of adults who think that they know better. And they're trying to shape the needs. They're trying to put programs and supports out there for what they perceive to be the needs as opposed to what youth are actually looking for. So this idea of perceived versus underlying challenges is something that I wanted to highlight. So when it comes to what we need to deal with, there's a very simplified model that I've got on the screen. If we have engaged youth that have good access to education and training opportunities, what we're going to end up with is employable young adults with the potential to repatriate them into this region. So people that we can bring back to where we want to have them. Now, that's ideal, and what we need in order to get to this point, and I've kind of crudely represented it with these blue lines here, is multiple, accessible, consistent supports from K to 12 into post-secondary and beyond. And so it's not that everyone's necessarily tightly integrated and working together at all times, but what we have is everyone moving in the same direction. So there's communication among the different organizations, say between the education sector and supporting nonprofits and that type of thing, and everyone's shuffling along in the right direction. What we have looks more like this. We have multiple disjointed, inconsistent, overlapping supports right now. And this makes it very challenging, not only for the youth who may need to access this, but it makes it challenging for people who want to identify where the gaps are and where we can fill the gaps, because it's a really hard thing to get a clear picture of. So when we ask the question of what's missing, the research that I did gave me the sense that there's two things that would be great for us to address off the get-go. And one is addressing this disconnect between youth and existing programs, and that means really ramping up active engagement, getting in the faces of the youth. So not a poster, not a Facebook group, not a digital e-blast, but showing up to the youth groups, to the classrooms, to the employment centers, and really creating a youth-specific active engagement. And then secondly, linking and leveraging and better communicating among what we have. So doing a better job of bringing all the amazing programs and all the amazing supports that we already have, but bringing them a little bit closer together, and so we can get a better sense of what is in fact missing from what we have right now. Okay, so opportunities. There's lots of opportunities, current and upcoming. I know through the RDI here, we've been involved in say, youth asset mapping projects, strategic doing projects that are involved in enhancing and connecting service providers. And the last few bullets that I've got up there were taken from the interviews that I did with youth and with youth experts as to what we really need. And that first bullet, the liaison between institutions, is an idea that I think personally is fabulous, because we might not be able to change an institutional mandate, or the Work BC offices or a federal government program may always have certain restrictions, but we could create a youth designated position whose job it is to know, understand, and communicate between all these different organizations, and then bring it back to the youth, maybe in the high school, maybe through a youth group, that type of thing. Consolidated access to information. Anyone who's ever tried to do research on anything There's so much information out there right now, and it can be incredibly overwhelming. I find that myself, and my job is to go through information. So the more we can consolidate information for youth, like that Newfoundland website example, and bringing all the things together so that they have a one-stop shop to go to, it's just going to increase the likelihood of programs getting used and more youth being reached. Ground transportation might seem tangential, but it's a really important one in rural areas. If youth can't get to a job, if youth can't get to a training program, that's a huge issue. You know, it might be a great program, but if no one can get there, that's a big problem. Youth want a range of opportunities. It seems as though we go through trends of all the programs pushing university or all the programs pushing the trades. That's a pretty negative thing, in my opinion. I think youth and what they were saying backed it up to me, is that they want to see a range of opportunities. They want to know all the things that they can do, and they should have the opportunity to do all of those things. And lastly, again, I'm going to hammer that collaboration point. We really be working to, nobody's going to be able to tackle some of the challenges around youth by themselves. Lastly, just a few resources. There's a website for workforce development around youth where I've put up some select examples from other places and resources. I also did a massive literature review and created a database. That's not up on our website, but if anyone's interested in seeing a bit more of the details, they can contact me. And for those who aren't interested in reading hundreds of pages worth of literature, we have research briefs. So, 2 to 3 pages worth of an overview of youth engagement, youth retention, youth training, that type of thing. And there's a consultation report. So the summary of all of what I'm talking about today, that'll be coming out next week through the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute's newsletter. So that is my presentation. I'm only 2 minutes over, not so bad. And happy to take any questions.
Okay, that's excellent. And I'm going to unmute everybody. So all of our panelists' microphones are now live. And we do have a couple questions that have come in into the Q&A box. So I'll ask everybody if they have questions to just type their answers there, and then I'll go through each one. So thank you again to our panelists. Those were all great. And the first question was from Mike Johnson, and I know it was while Dianne was doing her presentation, as he was wondering about how you define rural and remote rural, and if there's, I guess, a difference between them.
So if that's to me, rural was any community less than 10,000. And that is the definition that we use throughout the survey, even though some of those parameters changed. There are some people who say there's some areas of Nova Scotia you'd call remote rural, but I suspect those who live in northern BC and northern Ontario would say there's nothing remote in Nova Scotia. So it depends on your perspective. The rural communities were representative of the rural communities in Nova Scotia at the time.
Okay, great. The next question is for Ray, and Brian, I believe, is a student who was asking about the maps and graphs that you produced for any region in Canada from, can you produce those for anywhere in Canada from the labor force survey data sets? He says that he sees the special request for the labor force survey at the bottom, but what are the steps to get this information from StatsCan?
The data that are available would be on CanSim, and if you go to CanSim, search on CanSim, and just within CanSim search on LFS, you'll see all the data that is published. And when I put special request on the bottom of the slides, yes, I had to pay a few bucks, or my client had to pay a few bucks. We had to share a few bucks to go to Statistics Canada for a special tabulation. And I think simply you can go to infostats@statcan.gc statcan.gc.ca, or I think if you go to labor, LABOUR, at statcan.gc.ca and put in your request. I would like to know students during the summer by gender for the prairie provinces or something, and you go back and forth with the person at the other end to get it specified, and then they'll give you an estimate of how much it would cost, and if you agree, they'll push the button. So a special request to Statistics Canada or look at Canson.
Okay, great. And just as a little point for our participants, if you would like to follow up with any of the speakers individually, feel free to email myself or Sarah. I believe everybody should have my email at the bottom of the invite for this webinar. So if you're here, you should have my email at the bottom of my email signature. And I can put you in touch with the speakers. Another one from Brian was, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, it would be useful to locate geographic regions in the studies with an acknowledgement of the traditional lands and territories of people who have always been located there. How do connections to Indigenous communities and rural regional development impact on the numbers for these regional studies? Are the Indigenous populations included in these studies?
I can answer for mine. The research that we got the sample lists from schools, and the schools on reserves were not included any Indigenous people who would be attending those schools in the sample would be included. However, in Nova Scotia, the percentage is very, very small, and so there were too few to separate out. In terms of the location, we are on the territory of the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet. And the sample included all of Nova Scotia, which would include a lot of their territory.
Sorry. So here, I believe we have the Ktunaxa First Nations, and I think that there's one I'm missing, but please excuse me, I'm quite new to the area. So when I was recruiting youth, it was an open recruitment, but we didn't get anyone who identified as First Nations openly, at any rate, and it wasn't a question that we asked. Personally, not necessarily related to this research, but some other research that I'm doing, I think this is an area where we can greatly improve bringing First Nations into research. I know, say, for my dissertation research, it's looking at water, and because of the jurisdictional separation between how water's dealt with on First Nations land versus provincially here in British Columbia, I had to leave out First Nations, and so I think that myself as a researcher, and at least speaking for myself, that is something that needs to get better. We need to do a better job of bringing in First Nations to this type of research.
Okay, moving to the next question. Ruth Mealy, this is for Diane or Sarah. Are either of you aware of examples of communities or programs that have been successful in repatriating youth? If, for example, Bring Them Home program.
Yep, there's a great one here, and Ruth, I can send you the link for it, but it's called Project Comeback, and that was through, I believe, the BC Rural Network, and they did pilots in a number of communities across BC, and each community took a different approach, basically designed around retaining and repatriating youth and folks to rural areas, and so I can send that out to you. So that's Project Comeback. I believe there's another one in Alberta that I have a link for it somewhere. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. And then there's a lot of projects entitled things like You Can Do That Here or Make It Here, those types of things that are geared at bringing people back to rural areas, and there's quite a few successful ones out there.
Yes, the only program that I know of is the one that was in Newfoundland, and it was called Project Come Home. There is some research that has been done in Nova Scotia by Maggie McMichael on youth in-migrants who weren't from the area. And so I'd encourage people to look at the work that she's done on in-migrants, but it was not Come Home.
Okay. My next question is from P. David. And this is for you, Dianne, could the Nova Scotia results for youth be indicative of the situation in each of the other 3 Atlantic provinces? They have similar urban and rural splits. Paul, Emily, Emile, David is, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't looked specifically at the other Atlantic provinces, but I have compared my results to some national data sets, the Youth in Transition Survey, for example, and many of the patterns are very similar in terms of the number of rural youth and percentage of rural youth staying, returning, staying in the same community, and so on. So I think there would be some important differences, particularly, for example, in New Brunswick, there would be the Francophone division, and the issue in Newfoundland would be very different in terms of the distance getting in and off the island. But overall in Canada, many of the patterns that I report are very, very similar. And in terms of the identity with community, again, those have been very similar. I've got very similar results for national surveys, studies that were done by the New Rural Economy Project, and so on. So I think they're fairly robust findings.
Okay, great. And you know, when I ask these questions too, for our other panelists, feel free to chime in if you have a thought or a comment on any of our other ones. It doesn't have to be only specific people for the questions. It can be open to the panelists too. Ray, you're still there? I haven't heard from you in a bit.
Being quiet.
No, I just wondered you were still there. We hadn't forgotten about you.
The question on Aboriginals being included in surveys, I think people know Aboriginals on reserve are included in the census and the National Household Survey. The Labour Force Survey does not collect data on reserve, but they publish data for Aboriginals off reserve. And Aboriginals are identified on the survey, so there are tables, and you can do more tables for Aboriginals off reserve versus non-Aboriginals. And also for Aboriginals, you might look at the Aboriginal People Survey.
Okay, good. Okay, moving on, our next question is from Rochelle, specifically for Sarah, but have you seen a favored or more effective form of in-person engagement for youth, workshops or forums?
So when I was on a limited timeline with the project that I did, and I initially set up a series of focus groups and put up recruitment posters for youth to attend, offering I think free pizza and pop, and basically I did everything wrong. It wasn't a very interesting topic for your average 17-year-old, and pizza is certainly not a big enough draw. And I had a real challenge getting folks involved that way. I had much better success going through schools and setting up kind of lunchtime meetings through teachers who have that relationship built in with their students already. And the more that I did talk to youth, there's a real range out there, and I think that's the ticket, is getting the active engagement on multiple channels. Face-to-face is definitely a preferential way. There's a great example, a fabulous example of a youth network in Roslyn here in the Kootenays, where the coordinator will go into classrooms and recruit and talk to youth that way. And then also community groups will contact him and say, we have an opportunity for youth to be involved in X. And he'll take that to the folks that are involved in his youth network and ask them and say, you know, this opportunity has come up. Is anyone interested? And they have that opportunity to say yes or no. And I think that's really important as well, is often we have great ideas as to what would be an exciting opportunity for youth. Like, oh, would it be great to have a youth representative on our board council? Like, that's not the most boring thing in the entire world. And so giving youth an opportunity to be engaged in that process, and for them to step up and say what they do want, what they don't want. And again, multiple channels is what I would suggest. Some people are online all the time, others get fed so much online content that they ignore it, and you need to get in their faces. So I don't know if there's a single method that's preferred or more effective. I think hitting them as many ways as you can, as many channels as you can, as many times as you can.
Sure. Any other comments? That's good. Okay. Kind of similar on that theme for the youth. Otis, I know, is a student from Brandon University, and he was wondering about if the youth envision a sustainable livelihood living in rural settings. So specifically for Sarah, you emphasized the training and acquisition of skills for youth in rural BC. And is there a lifetime spread of the rate of returns as far as skill acquisition and training is concerned? Like, is there a retention of labor in those rural settings? Do they see themselves as having a future in rural settings, I guess?
So Ray would be better suited to speak to the actual numbers and data of people staying and going and that type of thing. But from a qualitative perspective, I saw almost two different groups of youth. One group that I met with, they had a more negative perception of rural settings, and a very limited one, and one that I think is a narrative that needs to change. They felt that there weren't a lot of job opportunities here, and they felt that the job opportunities that are here are limited to the trades and manual labor or tourism, bars and ski hills and that type of thing. And I think that this is a narrative that it's certainly not exclusive to the Kootenays. I'm from Northern Ontario originally, and that was a narrative that I was told as well. And I think that needs to be changed. In terms of a long-term sustainable livelihood in a rural setting, with the changing labor market and the ability to say work remotely, or technology startups, or that knowledge economy is growing in rural areas. And I think we have a job to do in changing the stories that youth are told, changing their perception as to what opportunities they have, because there's certainly at least a sizable group that feel as though there's no sustainable future here if you wanted to be a computer programmer, or if you wanted to design video games, and that's simply not true. Let's see, and then the other comment I'll add to that is what skills and training opportunities and education opportunities we're encouraging to the youth. I think there's room for improvement for what we're telling youth, like, go and take this course and you'll have a job when you graduate. Often that message is, we need truck drivers now, so it'd be a good idea if you went to school for a couple of years and got all your certificates to be a truck driver, only to come out and realize that job's already been filled, or it's become obsolete, or whatever it happens to be. I think when it comes to training and education, anyone involved in those types of things needs to do a better job of looking 10, 20 years out and going towards those skills, and encouraging youth to get away from that linear model of you go to school, you pick a career, you stick in that career, because that's not the way things are anymore. I think our youth need to be encouraged to become lifelong learners, to pick up as many skills as they have, because they're going to change careers. I'm on my fourth, and I'm only 32. So it's no longer the case that you just pick a career and stick with it. So I think if I was to say two critical points: one, change the narratives about what is available in rural areas, and two, broaden opportunities for training and education and make them more forward-looking instead of immediate-looking.
And your comment about that Ray would be able to comment on the migration might be true, because I was wondering kind of the same thing as far as perception versus actual. Like, is it and I actually was really surprised by some of Ray's slides showing that the trends in the employment rates haven't changed over time, which was really very interesting, because we sometimes have this perception that there's a mass exodus, and like you mentioned, that perhaps some youth might perceive that there's more opportunities in the rural settings, but I wonder if it is on more of a qualitative nature, that it's more perception, or if it is in fact a need. Like, are there more opportunities in the cities? But per populace, it looks like it just has always been that way. So I don't know, Ray, do you have a comment on, you know, do the youth envision a sustainable livelihood in rural settings, or is it that some people are going to urban settings because there's actually a need or demand for people to fill those positions? The one other thing that I noticed was, I found it very interesting that some of those perhaps early entry jobs, such as the hospitality industry, and you said sales and service, and sometimes some of the trade stuff, when youth under 24 first start in, say, an apprenticeship, you know, they start doing it, and that they don't need to have all of their papers yet. But I don't know, I touched on a lot of things there, but Ray, do you have a comment on any of that, I guess?
A couple of not terribly coherent observations. I guess I said at the beginning, you know, look at the 20-30% net out migration from the Kootenays between 15 and 19 and 2024. I said, was that half full, or is that glass half full or half empty? Mm-hmm. Don't you want many, many students to leave and get world experiences and get more education and experience and training and then come back? Or do you want 70% of them to stay? So there's a development conundrum. Certainly perception is very important, and I agree with what Sarah is saying. The more information you can give to youth, the better everybody's going to be. They'll just know what the alternatives are better. I guess some research I've seen is that young people, they say, why would I leave a rural area? You know, jobs, education, and fun. Can't get a job here, I got to go away to get education, and besides, the street lights go off at 9 o'clock. So there's that perception that there's more fun in the city. But then if you talk to young people in the city and say, what would entice you, or why would you move to a rural area, why would you move back to a rural area? It's more family and community. And that's because now they're thinking of marriage, kids, being close to grandparents, grandmothers, parents, siblings, and so on. So that's a draw to get them back. And it's a bit of a conundrum, which I said I'm slightly incoherent on this, but those are some things we might talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's also what Dianne was mentioning too, about the those close community ties to family. This is what we consider home. This is where we used to go to. That kind of same thing happens. But I guess, is that more so after they've gone to the urban setting and realized how good they had it, and then they come back? Or because by Sarah's description, it sounds like, you know, the youth have this perception that their community is, you know, not, the future is limited, but maybe that's because they haven't really explored those different horizons and realized how good it is in rural.
Well, it's actually a bit more complicated than that. One of the things I want to emphasize before I make the comment on that is keep in mind the vast majority of rural stay or return to rural. So the notion, we do talk as if there's this mass out migration, and because so many rural communities talk about losing their youth, but they keep or retain, get back most of them. So keep that in mind. In terms of going to the city and coming back, that can be, I mean, some of the people I quoted were coming back because that's the safety net. Okay, that's somewhere where they get support. If they break up with their partner, they can come home. If they have a baby and they need the mom to support them, they come home. If they lose their job, they have somewhere they can live. So there's a safety net issue. There's also some other research that I've read where people who go to the city and are exposed to a much more diverse because that's, a lot of people will, both the rural and the urban youth will admit that there's much more cultural, linguistic, racial, sexual diversity in cities that they're not used to in the rural areas. If you're used to that and you come home, you're kind of caught in a between land, because you're hanging out with some of your old friends you went to high school with, and you have some things in common with them because you grew up with them, but you have a different perspective because you live in the city. So there's a tension there. There was some research out of Australia, some people who left Tasmania and came back to Tasmania, and they didn't feel like they were from the mainland because now they're living back in Tasmania, but in Tasmania they don't feel like they're the same as the people they grew up with. So there's tensions there. And I think one of the things that youth services can offer is a recognition of that. The transition from rural to urban creates some adjustment problems. Universities have all kinds of programs to help people adjust to university, but as far as I know, nobody has a way to help rural youth adjust to a large urban setting. And when they come back to...
Did I lose Sarah there?
Rural communities recognize that there's this tension.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment there, Diane. I think
Okay.
Just that last sentence, I think we missed.
Okay, I was just saying, do any of the programs that Sarah's discussing, do they recognize the need to, the tension that exists when rural youth come back from especially large urban areas that they've been in, and they have a cultural disconnect?
Nothing explicit that I've seen. Sorry, there's a plane landing. My office is at the airport. That's what that noise is. But nothing explicit in any of the programs that I saw dealt with that culture clash of coming back from an urban setting to a rural one, or the reverse.
There might be a need there.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking on a practical side of things of what can we do or what can be done, programs or policy. Just kind of Sarah mentioned you can't just bring them in there with pizza. And she also mentioned that a multi-pronged approach of trying to reach the demographic is necessary. But any other thoughts or ideas on what ideas could help meet, maybe like you mentioned, is there a demographic that needs attention, or is there something that could help youth?
I really want to reiterate the point of getting to people early, particularly the portions of the population, youth or otherwise, that face a lot of barriers. The more help, the more programs, the more supports that they can get through early on in the education system, the fewer issues we're going to have at the back end when they're older. So yeah, getting in there early, that's a really big deal. Cumulative barriers are a problem. Somebody who's 25 and has faced nothing but issues trying to get an education, trying to get training, they're going to be infinitely more difficult to help than if that same person had have been identified when they were in elementary school and provided more support then.
So what would that look like? I know we have a couple of economic development officers on, and counselors, and many community leaders. Is it development of a youth center? Is it sometimes it's really popular now to have youth action groups to help even take charge of the direction that they want to see the opportunities for their community? Is it programs? All of the above? I don't know what you think.
Definitely all of the above. I mean, I saw some great examples from all over the world, some from Scandinavia, some from around Croatia, of business education partnerships where there's programs from the elementary to the high school where it links up the business community with the education community, and whether it's providing work experience, or there was an example from an island in Croatia where the students actually started a cooperative, and it hits all of these buttons. Like, they were making and producing kind of like handmade goods. So you get that cultural element. So they're maintaining roots in cultural things, learning arts and crafts from their heritage that are also being sold. And so they're learning that business element of it. And so you're getting in there with kids. And I doubt that they're, you know, recognizing all the things that they're learning when they're that age. But all of these skills that they're being taught all the way along the line, and making connections. And obviously there's some kids that aren't going to do well in a traditional school setting, but that doesn't mean that you can't start some sort of alternate school program where they're doing an apprenticeship while working on their GED or whatever else. I think it's getting multiple programs out there, because kids are as diverse as any portion of the population and will need all sorts of different opportunities, making them accessible. And then also having that overarching knowledge of, okay, we've got 30 programs that are all heading in this direction, and having that liaison person or officer, whatever it happens to be, so that they can either go to the youth or the youth can come to them and help them identify what would help them, you know, whether it's an education-based program, or maybe they need references to social services or that type of thing. Like, I think it's all of the above and more.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions, so I'll just open it up to the floor to our panelists. Do you have any other last comments, Dianne or Rain?
Well, I just reinforce what Sarah said, that some other research that I've looked at that's look at second chance programs and also early intervention programs. Get them early, get them often. That if you have a school feeding program, so that primary school children are not, you know, suffering from lack of food, then that can have a trade-off. I remember years ago, Ray presented a presentation on the importance of prenatal care and birth weight, and how that led to some important gains in terms of infant development and health. So that's very early interventions, but you know, there isn't one answer. There isn't one silver bullet. It is repeated, coordinated interventions to identify those who are most vulnerable and to find ways to assist them, which is what Sarah's been saying.
So Carol Curry just put up a comment in the Q&A section about more partnering between education, youth organizations, and economic development. And I think that's critical. And that came up a lot. I mean, we have in rural areas and urban areas alike a lot of expertise for economic development and workforce, and I think that we could do a great job, a much better job of partnering those folks with schools. And that's not to say that schools are doing a bad job. I mean, I did teaching. My older brother's a teacher, and he and I have this conversation a lot, where he'll end up teaching a careers class, but he went from high school to university to teaching. And so his knowledge of what's available for different career paths is limited by his own experience. So bringing in those external experts to help the teachers, not to put more work onto their plates, but to give them an extra resource from outside that they can use to give different perspectives and opportunities.
And I'd just like to emphasize also, as Sarah's saying, you get them early, grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, have the students make a list of all the different types of jobs that exist in this town. I predict they couldn't get 10% of them right. They know what jobs their kids' parents have, so they'll get 10%, but they will not have a clue, I'm guessing, the different types of jobs that are in the town. And do you need a Bachelor of Commerce to manage the home hardware? Then the next question is, what skills do you need to get that? My anecdote on that is, I was giving a talk to the Chamber of Commerce in Russell, Manitoba many years ago, and the person chairing the committee, chairing the meeting, is new to the community, so he asked, how many of the folks around the table were born and grew up in Russell? I think there were 30 around the table. One person said, yeah, I was born here. Another person said, I moved here at 2. Does that count? And 28% of the 28 out of 30 people on Main Street in Russell, Manitoba were not born in Russell. That's great. All sorts of new talent coming to town, and all the local people missed all the local jobs on Main Street. So it's a bit of an interesting conundrum, I think.
Very good. Okay. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for attending. Today's webinar was brought to you by the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute, who are a partner institution with the Rural Policy Learning Commons, a collaboration of organizations through North America and Europe to help improve rural policy. I'd like to thank our panelists again for their time. And for those participants, we will be posting the video on a variety of websites, and we will forward those links to you once they are uploaded, and also copies of the presentation. I also usually send out a little survey. It's about 10 questions. It's not that onerous, so if you can fill that out, that would be great. And we also have our next webinar on May 18th, which is Canada's Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program and impacts on relationships in Mexico. Similarly, if you're interested, feel free to email myself, blatherwickem@brandonu.ca. And I believe that wraps everything up. So thanks again for everyone for tuning in, and another great webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.